Hey guys, welcome back to A Push Lecture. Today we're continuing to talk about the Cold War, specifically talking about the Korean War. All right. This is an example of one of the proxy wars that we see during the Cold War. So the Americans and the Soviets aren't fighting each other directly. We're fighting through these other actors. All right. So a little bit of background: Korea had been occupied by the Japanese for many years before World War II, and then of course during World War II. So after the war, we have to demilitarize Korea, right? And we have to rebuild and set up like a stable government. And so the Soviets and the Americans are going to oversee this. The Soviets in the north, the Americans in the south, and both are going to leave in 1950. And what we see happen is neither could agree on a unified Korean government. So we have these rival regimes set up. The country is split along the 38th parallel. You can see that right here. It basically splits the country in half. All right. We have the communists in the north, right, backed by the Soviets and the Chinese. And then we have the nationalists or not communists in the South, right, backed by the Americans. And both are not really happy about this situation. They both want a united Korea. Also, the leader in the South, who we were backing, Syngman Rhee, he was not very popular, not very well liked, but obviously we're going to back him because he's not communist, okay? And then on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, right, in an effort to unite all of Korea under one communist government. And the North Koreans do this with the support of the Soviets and the Chinese, knowing that those other communist countries are going to come to their aid. All right. President Harry Truman sees this, immediately takes action, right? We are thinking about what led up to the last war we were in, right? How Japan took a bunch of territory, how Germany and Italy took a bunch of territory, and the League of Nations and the rest of the world sat around and did nothing, right? He remembered appeasement, he remembered this inactivity and said, we're not going to do that again. So the US immediately took this issue to the new United Nations and said, hey, we got to do something. They pressed for action on this situation. All right. The Soviets were absent from that UN meeting. So this allowed the Security Council to label North Korea as the aggressor for invading, right? And then the UN is going to vote to authorize a military response to this invasion. And this, of course, is going to be led by the US. All right. If the Soviets were not actually absent, they would have been able to use their veto power. So it was a good thing that they were absent. All right. So General MacArthur, who was kind of hanging out here in Japan, right, overseeing things, he's going to lead right over there into South Korea and lead a group of mostly Americans, but also South Korean and a bunch of other countries join in on this police action and invade right here at Pusan. Okay. So this is not technically a war, quote unquote, right? It's a UN police action. So there's no declarations of war or anything like that, right? But I mean, in all reality, of course, it's a war. So MacArthur and his troops land here at Pusan. They also do a landing here at Incheon, and they're able to push all those North Korean forces back over the 38th parallel. All right. But MacArthur goes further. He actually pushes them all the way back over here to the Yalu River, very close to the border with China. And that's where things get in trouble. So MacArthur, like I said, invaded at Pusan and then later at Incheon, pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel, get very close to the Chinese border, and this is when the Chinese get nervous. So they're going to send over volunteers, quote unquote, basically the Chinese Red Army, and thousands of Chinese troops are going to come over that border, and they're going to push the US and those South Korean forces back again, as you can see here, across the 38th parallel. All right. And by this time, it's winter, it's cold. The US is not prepared for this. All right. So it was pretty defeating. It was pretty humiliating for us. MacArthur is mad. He wants to escalate the war. He says we should use nuclear weapons. I think he was like, yeah, let's go drop 50 nuclear bombs on China, right? Truman said, no, cooler heads are going to prevail here. Truman refused to do that and ends up firing MacArthur basically for insubordination. All right. And so what we see here, starting in 1951, peace talks between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, the US, the Chinese, the Soviets, all the parties involved begin. And the war is basically at a stalemate for the next 2 years. All right. And this is one of the big downfalls of Truman, is that he's unable to end this war. When Eisenhower wins the 1952 election, that really becomes his top priority. And just a few months into his presidency, in July of 1953, we reached an armistice agreement, all right, as you can see here. So just a ceasefire, not an official peace treaty. No peace treaty has ever been signed in this war. And we're going to establish what's called a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone, right here, all right? So in the north, that remains officially the Democratic People's Republic of China. It's a communist country. It has a totalitarian, very authoritarian regime, right? Very little personal rights and freedoms. In South Korea, they have a democracy. It's very capitalist country. I always like to show this picture to show the difference between the development in North Korea and South Korea, over the many decades since the war, right? North Korea has remained this very isolated country, where South Korea is very integrated into the world, very much a part of the big world economy. Some of these big brands, Samsung, Hyundai, et cetera, they are all South Korean brands. They play a major role in our economy. Now, back at home, you can see right here, this is the Korean War Memorial here in Washington, D.C. It's known as the Forgotten War. People didn't pay a lot of attention to this war, nothing like what we saw in World War II, because it didn't really affect people's everyday life, all right? Even though thousands, tens of thousands of Americans died in this war that, again, wasn't really a war, technically. So what we see here is the Korean War is going to have some huge, huge effects moving forward, all right? It's going to strengthen this idea of what we call the domino theory, and you can kind of see that portrayed here. This idea that if one country comes under communist rule, the surrounding countries become vulnerable as well, right? China has fallen to communism. Korea, North Korea at least, has fallen, almost South Korea, right? Next might be Vietnam, then Laos, then Cambodia, right? And then all these dominoes are going to fall. And so we get very concerned about this. And so we're going to kind of double down on this whole containment idea, right? That we need to do whatever it takes to contain communism, right? So we're going to see a huge increase in military spending, and this is basically going to be sustained from this point to today. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. That was the lecture on the Korean War.